This is a ruthless, nasty, undemocratic institution that treats the people of Europe terribly.
To get Brexit done.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hi, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun. Brexit is finally happening. We're going to be talking about all things Brexit over the next hour with Brendan O'Neill. Brendan O'Neill is the editor of Spiked, an online website. He is a former member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He is a writer, a commentator, and an anti-woke warrior. We're going to be talking all things Brexit, from its history to its present to its future. You describe the last 10 years as the people's decade. What do you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that is that this is the decade in which the people reasserted themselves and basically said, we've had enough of being treated badly by the political establishment. We've had enough of either being ignored or too interfered with in terms of the nanny state and everything else. And people basically pushing back against that kind of politics, pushing back against the new elite technocratic politics and saying we want something different. We want more democracy, we want greater say, we want our opinions actually to count, and we want to remind you that we are here. And so if you trace, you could say that the decade starts with Gordon Brown running to be re-elected as Prime Minister, did incredibly badly. And one reason he did badly is that he had a very awkward encounter with Gillian Duffy, a northern working class woman who had voted Labour her whole life. And he was caught saying into a microphone that he thought was switched off. He called her a bigoted woman. And that caused an enormous fuss. I mean, people who are quite young may not remember just how much of a fuss it caused. And it really cost him a lot of votes. Fast forward to the end of the decade and you have the Boris revolt, where all those red wall Labour seats, many of them in fact, switch to Boris, rebel against the Labour Party and say we're no longer voting for you, you've taken us for granted, you've taken the mick out of us, you've treated us really badly, and now we're going to punish you. So I think it's a neat decade politically speaking, especially in terms of ordinary people saying we've had enough, in fact, of being treated badly, especially by the left-leaning sections of the establishment, and we're going to push back and ask for something different.
I really want to go back to the crux of the Brexit vote itself and why it happened. And I think that you're making a really good point there about the kind of distance between the working classes or maybe the masses and their rulers, and whether that's in Brussels or Westminster or wherever. Can you talk a little bit about the history behind that, when we joined the EU in 1973, and how that distance was created and how that resentment built up between the working classes and the people who ruled them?
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, and I think I've always seen the European Union and those Brussels-based institutions as a manifestation of the distance between ordinary British people and the British establishment. So what happens from the mid-1970s onwards through till the vote for Brexit, when we kind of said that's enough, the British establishment, like other European establishments, was outsourcing its authority to this foreign institution, to these institutions in Brussels, and basically giving them more and more say over key areas of lawmaking, over the borders, and over all the things that a sovereign state would traditionally have done for itself. Trade, borders, and the question of who writes the laws that we have to live by. All those things that sovereign states used to do for themselves by consulting their own people were increasingly handed out to suits in Brussels, technocrats in Brussels, people in Brussels over whom people like me and you have no direct control. So it was a fundamentally anti-democratic process, and it was really a manifestation of the elites' increasing sense of distance from and even disdain for ordinary British people, who they were just sick and tired of consulting us. They didn't want to ask us what we thought about big issues. They really didn't care what we thought about borders or immigration. In fact, they thought our views on those issues were backward and racist and stupid. And so they much prefer to consult with people who they saw as well-educated and sophisticated, people in Brussels, lawyers, people who run quangos, those, their kind of people. They started to do politics in a very insulated way, insulated from public pressure, insulated from ordinary people. And that's been growing since the mid-1970s in particular, with the EEC, and then later in the early 1990s it becomes the European Union, and also with the way in which judges now have more say in political life than they previously did, with the growth of quangos, this whole layer of political decision-making which is out of touch of the ordinary democratic voter. All those things have been happening, and it reached a breaking point. And the great thing about the referendum in 2016 is that it was the first time where the British people were asked not just to vote for a party who would run the country, but to answer the fundamental question of our time, which is, should we continue being members of the EU, or should we take back sovereign democratic control? And people seized that opportunity with relish. Voter turnout went up. The kind of people who gave up voting and hadn't voted for decades came out to vote. People took it very seriously because it was finally a chance to reprimand the establishment and say to them, you've gone too far with this outsourcing of democratic authority, and now we want to take back control.
Do you know what I find absolutely fascinating about that vote? And I think you hit on the point there, is it was the first time we were ever consulted on this since 1975.
Yes.
And all the way back in 1975, voters probably didn't think that the EU would adapt to what it is today. Can you talk about the kind of lie, as some people would put it, that they were sold in 1975, and how the EU continued to adapt, continued to centralise power more and more away from those who, those ordinary voters, and how the British people were never consulted, not even once, not even one treaty had a referendum in Britain.
That's right, absolutely right. The EEC was understood to be an economic relationship. We were told that it would be beneficial to the UK if we had this economic relationship with this block of countries, a fairly small block of countries back then in Europe. And it was understood by most people who then eventually voted in the referendum that came in 75. It was understood that it was a fairly narrow relationship. It was going to be economically based. It wouldn't have a grave impact on Britain as a sovereign nation. That's the lie we were told. And people accepted that, and for good reason. I don't think people were hoodwinked or brainwashed. People weighed things up and said, okay, if it's just going to be about economic partnership, if it's just going to be about trading and so on, and economic standards, we can live with that. Let's give it a whirl. Of course, what happens then through the 80s and then right through to the early 90s and then onwards from then, it becomes the European Union. It becomes a much more political body. It becomes a body that has a very significant say over the laws that we live by, over the ability of us to control our borders, over the free movement of people, the free movement of goods, the free movement of services across the continent or across the European Union. So it becomes much more powerful. It becomes much more political. It becomes much clearer that this is a body that significantly has a detrimental impact on our sovereign rights and on our integrity as a democratic nation. And people saw that, and that's why anti-EU sentiment, Euro scepticism, grew over that time, particularly in the 1980s, and particularly among those communities who felt left out of politics anyway, working class communities, the Red Wall communities. Every poll and survey really shows that the more working class you were, the more likely you were to have voted Brexit. That's not to say everyone who voted Brexit was working class, but that's the way it works. So, so over time, it became this monstrous institution that people didn't like. And it really raised what is the key question of English and history in particular, but also British history, which is the question of, if you're expected to live by a law, then you ought to have some right or some capacity to influence the making of that law. I mean, that's the fundamental nature of democracy. That's why we had a civil war in this country in the 1640s, precisely over the question of why we should live by laws if we have no control over who makes them. That's what the suffragettes argued in the 1910s, particularly the ones who engaged in civil disobedience. They said, well, if we have no role in making laws, why should we live by them? So that's been the overarching question of the demand for democracy in this country for hundreds of years. That's why I see the vote for Brexit as incredibly positive, because this was millions upon millions of ordinary people making the same statement, which is if we are expected to live by laws, they should be made by parliamentarians we elect, not by commissioners in the European Commission over whom we have no direct control at all, who are appointed, who make laws, and then just foist them through to the European Parliament for a yes or a no. A completely and utterly undemocratic, unaccountable process. And the revolt against that, I think, is one of the most positive political things that's happened in this country in decades.
You've hit on a really interesting point there about the history of Brexit and how it's almost like an English tradition, having sovereignty and the freedom of the individuals and their rights, etc. I mean, David Starkey, I was speaking to before the election, was talking about Henry VIII's split with Rome as being the kind of first event in which led up to Brexit. And you're touching on some fantastic movements in the past, which obviously we all look back on now and think, wow, you know, that was obviously the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Suffragettes, brilliant example. And about all those movements, I think that another thing that's interesting is that they cut between party lines. They're not left, they're not right. They're about this thing called sovereignty. Can you explain what sovereignty means to you and what it actually is? Because it's a word that's banded around a lot, and some people don't really understand what it is. And I know that you come from a left background. You would not describe yourself as right. I mean, worked with Living Marxism, former member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Can you explain? You know, it's not why it isn't a left-right issue.
Yes, that's a very good point. And sovereignty is not a party issue. Everyone believes in sovereignty in at some level. The question is who they think sovereignty should be invested in. Sovereignty basically means the power of a nation, the right of a nation to determine its own affairs within its own borders, without interference from external bodies. You know, that's what it means to be a sovereign nation. And then there's the question of who or what should sovereignty be invested in. As you say, I come from the left. I have a fairly radical view about democracy. I'm very sceptical of monarchy. I'm deeply sceptical of the House of Lords. I'm very interested in arguments being made by Nigel Farage and even a few people around the Boris government about radically reforming the House of Lords or possibly even abolishing it, because I see that unelected chamber as a barrier also to democratic sovereignty. My view is that sovereignty lies with the people. And this is a point that Tony Benn, one of the great Labour radicals, who people are rediscovering now because he made so many articulate arguments against the European Union, and he was, I would say, our most articulate Eurosceptic of the past few decades. He said that sovereignty lies with the people, and what happens in a general election is that we lend our power to politicians, and they act on our behalf, and if they don't, they'll be in trouble. And then we know that in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, we'll get that power back, we'll reconsider it, and then we'll give it to someone else. So he talks about the sovereignty of the people. And that's my view. My view is that if you are a democratic nation, then sovereignty must lie with the people. They must be the people who make the decisions about who the lawmakers should be and what their general agenda should be. And if you have that kind of country, then it's a democratic country. The whole problem with the European Union is that it interfered with that process in a very real way. And that's why I'm so confused and slightly angered when I see people refer to Euroscepticism as hard right and fascistic and just a bunch of little Englanders and backward, stupid, xenophobic people who don't understand how politics works. I think none of that is true. I think all the defamation that Brexit voters have suffered over the past 3.5 years from members of the elite who think we're all really stupid. What I think those members of the elite don't appreciate is that ordinary people do understand the importance of national sovereignty. They do understand the importance of democracy. And the reason they understand it is because the vote is really the only power they have. It's the only voice they have. They don't do podcasts like this. They don't have newspaper columns. They don't have a seat in the House of Lords. They don't work in a quango which can have private meetings with ministers. They don't. The vast, vast majority of people don't do any of those things, but they have the vote, and the vote is the vote is the thing that makes them equal to all the powerful people on election day. So I've made the point before that Gina Miller, the notorious Remainer who did everything she could to stop Brexit, the person who cleans her, no doubt, palatial home has the same power as she does on election day. And that's the great equalising thing about the vote. That's the great, it's the great insurer of equality is the right to vote. So I think ordinary people are incredibly sensitive to the importance of the vote, and that's why they were so determined to make sure that not only that we shove aside the European Union, but then once we had decided to do that, that Brexit had to happen, because they recognised that if Brexit was prevented, then that would call into question their right to vote more broadly. And I just wish more people in the establishment would appreciate that most people are just concerned with the nature of democracy and are very keen to ensure that democracy survives.
Let's talk about the establishment. I know that it's something that, again, it's another one of those words that are sort of banded out there. It's quite vague, it's quite generic, it's quite all-encompassing. I want to talk about specific members of the establishment, as it were, over the last 40 years who one might blame for Brexit happening. Let's start with Tony Blair, the Prime Minister in 1997, and for about 13 years Labour in power. What impact did he have on the Brexit vote? And what can you get into the ethos? I want to get into the ethos, into the mind of Tony Blair, into the mind of these people, on why do they think that they can get away with basically ignoring vast swathes of voters, and what is it about their mindset that means that that's how they think and that's how they do things? They think people are more, these people are stupid, they're not intelligent, they can't make their own minds up, so they have to have this institution doing it for them.
That's exactly what they think. They think they are better than us. I mean, they really do. That's a very old-fashioned establishment view, which some of us had thought had died out with the end of the age of deference and, the events of the 1950s and particularly the 1960s, when people started to call into question the establishment. Anyone who watches The Crown will be aware that those things happened, and royalty was in crisis, and the old stuffy political establishment was in crisis. And ordinary people said, no, we're not going to bow and scrape anymore. We're going to think a bit more for ourselves. But it turns out the establishment still thinks that they know better than us. And Tony Blair embodies that in many ways. He embodies that kind of arrogance, that aloofness and that sense of dislocation from ordinary people's concerns and ordinary people's right to have a say in political life. I think Tony Blair has a lot to answer for in the state of politics in this country. There's this tendency to blame Jeremy Corbyn for Labour's catastrophic defeat in the December election. And of course, he bears most responsibility. He's an awful leader. He's untrustworthy. The ordinary working class Labour voters just didn't like him and didn't like his policies, didn't like the fact that he associates with radical Islamists, didn't like any of that. So that's true. But I think the collapse of the Labour Party has been a long time coming, and it can be traced back to Gordon Brown, it can be traced back to Tony Blair, it can be traced back to their embrace of a kind of neoliberalism, the European Union, of course, and all of that kind of distant, aloof, undemocratic, technocratic politics, managerialism as some people refer to it, where politics would be a managerial process where what you would have is this layer of experts who would decide what the best policies are, what the best way to run society is, and then basically just impose it on the rest of us. So that era of managerialism, which really turned off huge numbers of people, a lot of that can be traced back to Tony Blair and to that whole era. So he has a lot to answer for in terms of the denigration of political life in this country. And it's not surprising that, everyone always says, oh, he won 3 huge victories. It's true, but his vote numbers went down every time. And the people who stopped voting for him were working class Labour voters. So in 1997, he got huge numbers of working class Labour voters and loads of other people. A huge victory in 97. But then in his later electoral victories, he did much worse. And the
turnout went down.
Turnout went down.
That was the key thing.
Yes, turnout went down, and the people who switched off were predominantly working class Labour voters who were just not impressed by what they were seeing. And they stopped voting entirely because most of them couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Tory party. But then they started voting again when Nigel Farage's UKIP came on the scene, and millions of them turned to UKIP and saw that as a vehicle for bringing about a referendum and changing politics. So, but people like Tony Blair and that kind of new-ish establishment, they are very arrogant, they are very snooty, they are convinced that democracy is an old-fashioned system because you have to consult all these ignorant plebs. And they really would prefer if politics was done by them and their friends and the people they like in Brussels. That's now been blown apart. So I'm just amazed that Tony Blair is still on our screens talking. I just want to say to him, Tony, no one wants to hear from you. We've heard enough. Your side has lost, and you really should retire gracefully from this political life that you're still pursuing.
So you've got a divide between people who perhaps would say they're proud to be British, proud to be English, and you've got those, maybe Tony Blair is a great example of that, and maybe Emily Thornberry is another one. I know she's running for the Labour leadership, and she infamously got sacked for tweeting out a picture of a St George's flag in Rochester, basically saying, oh, look at how disgusting this is. So you've got that divide between a lot of people, most people I'd say in Britain, who are proud of their identity, and those who probably would, I don't know, hate their own country, as some would say. Let's talk about Britain's national identity, because I'm happy to say that I'm proud to be British, I'm proud to be English. You know, we've got a huge, long history. We've got a lot to be proud of. We've got a lot to not to be proud of as well, as a lot of people try to remind us these days. And the Brexit vote, maybe that was a great example of where you saw that divide really go across the nation. So you've got those kind of people in London, who metropolitan kind of type of people who probably would be ashamed to say that they're British, we're global citizens, we're the Jeremy Corbyns of this world. And then you've got people who perhaps would think the complete opposite. Can you talk about where that divide started and why that divide is there?
Yeah, I think it's been there a long time. George Orwell wrote about intellectuals who hate their own country, and talking about English intellectuals, and he said they feel more comfortable in France and in Italy, where they would travel and meet people and go away for 6 months to write their books. And he wrote very well, I think in the 1930s, about English intellectuals who hate Englishness, and who hate people who have a strong attachment to Englishness and prefer the continent because they see it as more civilized and more sophisticated. So it's always been there. It's always been bubbling under the surface, that sense of national shame that some members of the kind of middle class cultural elite have. But I think it's exploded in recent decades, and it's really come to the fore. And it's all part of the corrosion of democracy that's been taking place as the European Union has grown and grown. Because what we ended up with was this real tussle between an establishment that was saying, you know, the nation, we're in a post-nation era, borders are outdated, nationalism is the worst thing in the whole world. Anyone who cleaves to the nation is obviously racist and stupid and xenophobic, and the better thing to do is to be open to Europe, open to the world, and all this kind of stuff. And the problem with that is firstly that these people present themselves as open, but they are not particularly open at all. And if you look at the European Union, for example, it has some really stringent rules on trade and so on, which has had a devastating impact on agriculture in Africa, which makes it very difficult to have a proper free trade deal with the US, all these things. So it's what Barbara Castle, who was a great Labour Party figure in the 1960s and 70s, she was Eurosceptic, and she did a speech at the Oxford Union in 1975 saying that she referred to it as Euro-jingoism. So she said this is a little Europeanism. So we're not actually opening to the world by moving into this institution. We're just going into this small closed-off world of European Union elites. So she kind of saw what was coming. But yes, the key problem, I think, is that there is this divide between ordinary people who feel a very strong attachment to the nation and an establishment that's very sniffy about the nation. My view is that there is nothing progressive whatsoever in this national shame. There's nothing progressive in this idea that Britain has this horrible, racist, colonial past. I think it's absolutely right to study Britain's past, absolutely right to question empire, to question some of the things that Britain did in India, in Ireland, in Africa. Absolutely, that's a historical pursuit. We should always talk about those things and question those things and learn from those things. But to turn that into this kind of self-flagellation and this constant sense of disgust and this idea that Britain is just marked by this original sin of empire from which we will never recover, that's just self-loathing. That's just national self-loathing. It's completely depressing. It's completely negative. And in fact, one of the things that working class Labour voters in particular really bristled against in the 2019 election was when they would have canvassers from the Labour Party, usually middle class, very often from London, people they'd never met working class people before. They were knocking on doors in Yorkshire and elsewhere, and these canvassers were just talking about how terrible everything was. Isn't this country terrible? Isn't your community terrible? Aren't your schools terrible? We'll come and make it all better. And, lo and behold, people don't want to be told that their lives are terrible. They don't want to be told that their communities is terrible, and they don't want to be told that their nation is terrible, because often those things just aren't true.
We're going to get onto that pessimism versus optimism in a minute. But final question on why Brexit happened. And again, another thing you've touched on there, which is really interesting, is the kind of moral high ground that these people feel. We're the good guys. We love the EU. It's something to feel good about. And those people who perhaps voted Brexit are not necessarily good people, they might think.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, I'm a young person. I should really be voting Remain. That's what 75% of young people did in the referendum. And they obviously feel that the European Union is somewhere where you can go and work abroad and you can travel for free and you can get free roaming data. And it's this fantastic global institution that we should be proud of and that we should feel really good about. What is it about that kind of moral high ground that they hold? Why do they hold the moral high ground on this issue? Because they shouldn't really, should they?
No, absolutely shouldn't. The European Union is not an admirable institution. The European Union is a terrible institution. It's authoritarian, it's illiberal, it's undemocratic. It has basically destroyed the Greek working classes. It effectively colonised Ireland for a couple of years by sending in the Troika to run the Irish economy over the heads of elected Irish politicians. It's currently meddling in the Italian government and basically hand-picking ministers who should run that country, even though Italy is very Eurosceptic. And funnily enough, in Italy, it tends to be the young who are most Eurosceptic, whereas in the UK, it's older people. It ignored democratic votes against the European Constitution in 2005. The French voted against it, the Dutch voted against it. It just ignored them and went ahead and enforced the Constitution under the name the Lisbon Treaty. It has forced the Irish people to vote again twice in two referendums, in 2001 and 2007. The Irish people rejected European constitutions. It forced them to vote again, and it told them if they didn't vote the right way around this time, they'd be in trouble. This is a ruthless, nasty, undemocratic institution that treats the people of Europe terribly. So the Remainers have no moral high ground at all. And I think it's really important to constantly remind them they are supporting a pretty ruthless organisation, which is not a friend of the European peoples. But they assume this moral high ground because I think what's important about Remainerism is that I don't actually think it's completely linked to the question of the European Union. I think it's become its own identity. It's a new form of elitism, and it's the way in which a certain section of society presumes their moral authority over the masses, over the kind of the pig ignorant plebs as they see us, over ordinary people. It's the Remainer ideology is the way in which they do that. So it's like an in-club situation. So on Twitter, in real life, on their protests, at their dinner parties, the nod of approval, are you a Remainer? And of course you have to be. And if you're not, you will just be cast out. I know lots of people who work in the arts, in universities, in publishing, and they voted Brexit and they have never told a single person. Because in those worlds, it's so well established and so accepted in a conformist way that you have to be a Remainer to be a good person, that other people dare not express their Brexit sentiments. So it's become an identity unto itself. It's not even. That's why I think it will carry on. Even now, it's pretty well established that we are leaving the European Union. The Remainer identity will carry on because it's not just about the European Union. It's about a certain layer of elitist society in the UK re-establishing what they see as their moral authority over everyone else. So that's why they hold on to it with dear life, and that's why it's so difficult to shake their arrogance.
I think you gave a really articulate sort of monologue about why the EU isn't a great thing. Yet we have to face up to the fact that the EU is popular in European countries, and Britain is the only country that has voted to leave. Why is that?
That's a very good question. I mean, there is Euroscepticism. In some countries, it's more profound than other countries. It's kind of there's a fair amount of it in Italy at the moment, but there's not much in Germany, for example. I think there's a lot of Euroscepticism in France at the moment, and the Gilets jaunes protesters who've been protesting every weekend for more than a year. Lots of Euroscepticism on there. You will frequently see people waving banners saying Frexit. A lot of Gilets jaunes protesters celebrated the election of Boris Johnson in December because they said they thought, right, Brexit's finally going to happen. So it is there that many countries, and in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of Euroscepticism because the European Union treats Eastern European countries pretty badly and often will put pressure on elected governments not to pursue certain policies. So it is there, but I think you raise a really important point, which is I think our vote for Brexit, the initial impact it had in Europe was to send a signal to lots of European people that it's possible to leave the European Union. So I think a lot of people felt initially very energized by Brexit. And I met people in Europe all the time who were saying, is it going to happen? What arguments did you make for Brexit? What can we say in our country? So there was a real appetite and real interest in Brexit as a phenomenon. But over time, the European Union very consciously used the Brexit negotiation process to demonstrate to the rest of Europe that if you leave the European Union, it's going to be really hard and you will suffer and you will get a really bad deal and your trade ability will go down and your economy will suffer. So one of the important aspects of Project Fear was not simply to try and make British voters change their minds, which we didn't do, but also to send a message to the rest of Europe that, keep your Euroscepticism in check. Don't go too far. Don't go so far as to vote against the European Union itself because life will be very difficult for you. And I think that's probably had an impact. I think that's probably had an impact on Europe because if you think that we've been talking about Brexit now for nearly 4 years, I mean, it's scandalous how long it's taken. And the negotiations have been purposefully very tortured, purposely very drawn out, purposely very antagonistic, because the European Union is worried about its own survival and its own future. So it always has one eye on the rest of the continent and making sure that those pesky populations don't rise up as well. So I think that's had an impact. Hopefully, I'm hoping that when Brexit happens, and now that we're leaving, and it's pretty secure, and let's see what happens afterwards, I'm hoping that the rest of Europe will say, okay, it is possible, and recover that sense of optimism that they had after the Brexit vote, but which tended to disappear over the past 3 years.
What a club to be in, eh? Let's talk about the past 4 years that you touched on there. And again, I want to go back to that pessimism versus optimism argument. Now, on this show, we do care about history and we do care about quotes. So I'm going to quote Churchill, and he said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." Over the last 3 years, we've seen absolute chaos politically in Britain. We've seen Theresa May as Prime Minister try and fail to get a Brexit deal. We've seen Remainers in various institutions, the BBC, the media, lawyers, the courts, etc., and in politics, in Parliament, obviously, being key, trying, as what you might see and I probably see, to stop Brexit and trying to stop this democratic result from happening. Is it as simple to say, well, look, it's the pessimists versus the optimists? I mean, the pessimists have basically been in charge of the country, got Theresa May. She never wanted Brexit.
No.
She voted Remain. Or am I being too mild? Was it a conspiracy? These Remainers, they set out from day one, we're not going to deliver this thing. In fact, we're going to try and do everything we can to stop it.
Good question. I don't think it. I think it is right to say it's pessimists versus optimists. I think that really captures what's going on. Remainerism is a deeply pessimistic movement. It's depressing. I mean, they're really depressing people. Anyone who's hung around with, not Remain voters, I mean, that's 16.1 million people. We all know Remain voters. They're perfectly normal people, most of whom are just getting on with their lives and not spending their time agitating against Brexit. But if you talk to the much smaller number of people who have devoted themselves to stopping Brexit, establishment figures, they're depressing people. They really have a depressing view of the world, and they really have a pessimistic view of of Britain's capacity to be a sovereign nation, and of ordinary people's capacity to make good political decisions. They're down on everything, and I'd go even further. I don't think pessimism is strong enough. I think it's catastrophism. It's this sense of catastrophe, this sense of impending doom, and that's why they keep talking about Brexit as being like the 1930s, and a fascistic element to the Brexit vote. And, all sorts of people, the Archbishop of Canterbury, even Prince Charles, I think, were making comments to suggest that that dark moment from history was kind of coming back via the Brexit vote and the Trump vote and everything else. Just catastrophism, this idea that the whole thing would be a catastrophe, and the whole... my favourite headline was the front page of the Evening Standard, which said, if we have a no-deal Brexit, there will be an outbreak of super gonorrhea. And I thought this it was so ridiculous. I'm sure everyone who saw it just laughed. But this sense that there will be, it was almost biblical, there'll be disease, pestilence.
Going to run out of sandwiches.
No wine, no cheese. In a very short period of time, there was a headline on the BBC News which said, we'll run out of food with no deal Brexit, but then there was another one saying we'll have too much meat and we won't know what to do with it. And so they couldn't even get their story straight. So... catastrophism, that's what it was. But what's really the reason I think the other side, it's legitimate to call them optimists or maybe rebels or something, because the most heartening thing of the past 3.5 years is that people didn't fall for that. I'm sure some people did, but the majority of people didn't. And poll after poll was finding that there were little blips in whether people would have voted leave or remain again, but mostly people were sticking with their desire to leave the European Union, even in the face of this onslaught of fear and panic and catastrophe and pessimism. And of course then we had the vote for Boris, in which huge numbers of people basically restated their desire for Brexit in the most dramatic way possible. So the failure of the pessimistic project is really interesting, and I think really, really positive and heartening, because it shows that the politics of fear often doesn't work. It doesn't cut through, and people don't believe it. They're sceptical. They think, I don't believe the country will go down the pan. I don't believe we can't survive outside the European Union. I refuse to believe you. So there's something really positive in the way in which ordinary people just didn't believe Project Fear, and held on to their optimistic belief that democracy was a good idea and Britain being a sovereign nation is a good idea. So that has been the battle, and right now the optimists are winning.
Now, this next question, I might have to warn some viewers, it may trigger them, it certainly triggers me, thinking back over the last 3 years what actually happened. Now, June 24th, we vote for Brexit. I'm excited, I'm sure you are excited, optimistic, it's going to be great. 3 years down the line, hasn't been delivered. Obviously, it's all turned out all right in the end, but I want to ask, what happened? How did we get here?
That is such an important question. And one thing that's irritating me at the moment, lots of people are now saying, let's move on. Since the vote for Boris, people are saying, okay, fine, Brexit's going to happen, let's move on. Keir Starmer has said that. Other political figures have said that. And I want to say, no, not so fast, actually. We can't just move on. Remainers are saying it, and also Brexiteers, including Boris, has said something similar. Let's move on now together as a nation. Right, that's fine as an idea, but we have to talk about what happened. We have to talk about those 3.5 years and what happened to the fact that the vote wasn't acted upon. That's the first thing that we need to talk about. And secondly, the fact that the political establishment went mad. Right, they went crazy. I've never witnessed anything like it in my life. It was the most, in my lifetime and many others people's lifetimes as well. It was the most serious outburst of establishment hysteria. They went nuts. They really genuinely did. They were talking about the end of the world as we know it, doom, hunger, starvation, death from disease. I mean, they went crazy. And they blocked this democratic vote. They did everything within their power. They used parliamentary means, they used legal means, they used political means. They did everything within their power to stop the enactment of the largest democratic vote in the history of this country. We can't just forget that. There needs to be a reckoning with that period of time. There needs to be an analysis of that period of time. My view as to why it happened and why I think we should carry on talking about this is that it was the first time really since we got the franchise, and we've only had the franchise for 100 years, or if you count it as 1928, which is the year in which women under the age of 30 could vote, we've had it for less than 100 years, so we haven't had the vote that long. And it's the first time we used the vote to revolt against the entire establishment. So not just to pick a party or a prime minister or whatever, but to revolt against the entire establishment worldview. That had never happened before. And, if you think back to the run-up to the referendum, pretty much the whole establishment, apart from a few kind of political renegades and the Vote Leave movement, which had some politicians involved. But, the Conservative Party, David Cameron, George Osborne, the European Union itself, Barack Obama, the United Nations, the church, every celebrity, all forms of authority were saying, okay, listen up everyone, you've got to vote Remain. And people said, no, we're not going to do it. Sorry, guys, we're going to pull the carpet out from under your feet and ruin your lives. That's essentially what the voters said in a very positive way. So that had never happened to the establishment before, and as a consequence, they went nuts. They really lost the plot in a way that I have never witnessed before. And that's, I think that period is coming to an end now, because they finally realise that the people are serious about Brexit, and the people are serious about wanting this to happen, and that if you carry on defying it, you will destroy democracy itself. I think they're finally coming around to that realisation. But that doesn't mean we should move on. We do have to talk about what happened. We do have to talk about what they did, and we do have to talk about what they said about people. Ordinary people aren't going to forget the insults that were thrown their way, and I don't think we should forget it either.
I want to talk about motive, because some people have varying views of, let's focus on Theresa May, for example. So she was obviously the Prime Minister. Some say she felt it was her duty to deliver Brexit for everyone, for Leavers and Remainers. Obviously, she would argue that. She wanted to unite the country. She wanted to deliver Brexit genuinely. But she just failed to get a deal because everyone was against her. Everyone. She had the EU, she had the ERG, she had some people on sort of the Remain side of the party. Everyone was stacked against her, and obviously she failed. The other view is that it was a more thought through thing, in that she became Prime Minister. She said, right, I'm going to go behind my ministers' backs. I'm going to go through work with civil servants like Ollie Robbins. I'm going to work my damn hardest to get a soft Brexit or to stop Brexit altogether. What's your view? Is it somewhere in between?
I'm so torn on Theresa May, because I think my end view of her, as her leadership was coming to an end, is that she was just trying to stop Brexit. So I eventually came around to that view. But when Brexit first happened, and then Cameron leaves and she becomes Prime Minister, leader and Prime Minister, she made all the right noises. If you remember her first ever speech outside Downing Street, and then subsequent to that, when she called the general election, she was saying things like, there are sections of the establishment that want to stop Brexit. There are members of the elite who want to make sure you don't get your say, and I'm going to stop them from doing that. And a lot of people believed her and hoped that she was telling the truth, but it turns out she wasn't. And it turns out that, as you said earlier, she was a Remainer. She voted Remain. And we had this terrible situation where a Remain politician, and a very technocratic politician, which is what she was as well, was put in charge of Brexit, and it was never really going to work. And I think she did, it got to a situation where she was working very hard to get a soft Brexit, which in my view is not Brexit at all. The idea of soft Brexit and hard Brexit are post-referendum terms. No one talked about them before the referendum. They just came in after the referendum, and hard Brexit always referred to just Brexit. And soft Brexit was all the ways in which the establishment thought they could water it down and keep us in the customs union, keep us in the single market. So she was pursuing a soft Brexit, which was a betrayal of the vote, because the vote was a vote to take back control, which in my view very obviously meant leaving three institutions: the European Court of Justice, the single market, and the customs union. And why? Because all of those institutions have a detrimental impact on your sovereign decision-making power. The European Court of Justice impacts on your lawmaking power, the single market impacts on your ability to control your borders and immigration, and the customs union impacts on your sovereign ability to strike up trade deals and around the world. So it was very clear that that's what Brexit meant, and she wanted to redefine it to mean, well, let's be kind of in the customs union, let's align with single market regulations, and it will all be fine. So I think, yes, after a while, and maybe this crept up on her as much as it did on everyone else, but after a while it became very clear that she was working against Brexit with her small group of people and other leading ministers who were very anti-Brexit. And the people had had enough of it, and she became increasingly unpopular, and Boris started to become more popular because he was indicating that he would take Brexit seriously. So that's what happened with Theresa May. I think what she demonstrates, this is why she's important in this whole drama, she demonstrates the true nature of soft Brexit, and the true nature of soft Brexit, which is why I've never accepted that term as a solution to this issue. The true nature of soft Brexit is to stop Brexit and to make sure that the people don't get their way. All that we need to have now is Brexit, a proper Brexit, and hopefully we're going to finally move into that world.
Now, if I was James O'Brien sitting here, he might argue that it's not Theresa May's fault. It's not all these people that you're blaming. It's Brexit itself. It's inevitable. If we voted for Brexit, of course it was going to be a disaster. Of course we're going to have chaos. Of course all this stuff was going to happen. What would you say to that argument? Complete
nonsense. Fatalistic, anti-democratic, anti-people, anti-British nonsense. The idea that Brexit in itself is impossible is completely and utterly untrue. We survived outside of the European Union for most of the existence of this nation. We've only been in the European Union proper since the early 1990s, and then the EEC since the mid-1970s. This is a new institution. It hasn't been around forever. And that fatalism that people have, where they say, well, the whole problem is Brexit just isn't possible. Really, they think they're being clever, but actually they're just revealing their kind of bourgeois fatalism, that sense of, we need to link up with other clever, intelligent people in Europe because we're such a rubbish nation. We're such our institutions are so naff. Our people make the wrong decisions. Parliament isn't really up for the job of politics, and therefore we have to give more and more power over there. It's a really self-loathing, fatalistic view of the United Kingdom, which thankfully is rejected by most people. And it's not surprising that it comes from the James O'Briens of the world. A lot of these people are kind of privately educated establishment figures who live very much in their own world, live very much in their own bubble, don't have much interaction with working people, have never been probably to Wrexham or Blackpool South or the Vale of Clwyd or any of these other places that voted for Boris Johnson in December. Have no connection with those people, no understanding of those people, and no appreciation of how much those people are committed to the idea of democracy and national sovereignty. So when I encounter Remainers, when I do media debates or whatever with Remain people, I'm always amazed how completely and utterly out of touch they are with public sentiment, and how completely and utterly distant they are from ordinary people. And someone like James O'Brien sums that up. His relationship with ordinary people is just to bark insults at them when they phone in his radio show. So the idea that Brexit is the problem, it's just not doable, I think is completely and utterly ridiculous. And it will be proved wrong, because I'm pretty confident that we will make a very good fist of being outside of the European Union.
I want to talk about Donald Trump. Now, a lot of people say that it was a coincidence the same year you've got 2016, Brexit and Trump. How much are they linked? Because there is the argument about the people versus the establishment. And then in America, you've almost had the same reaction as they've had in Britain to his election, in that now he's going for impeachment, and a lot of people have basically tried to get rid of him from day one. So what's the kind of similarities and differences between those two?
I think they have a lot in common. I think the votes for those two things have a lot in common. I think Trump is a much more complicated prospect. He does a lot of crazy things. He has a lot of problematic views. Whereas Brexit, I think, is a much cleaner phenomenon, because it's not a vote for any individual, it's not a vote for any party. It's just a vote for an idea, which is let's leave the European Union. So it's a much cleaner populist rebellion. Whereas I think the vote for Trump, which I think was also a populist rebellion, is a bit more complicated, a bit more confusing because of him as a person has some questionable ideas, shall we say. But I think there are loads of links between these two things. I think it's not a coincidence that they both happen around the same time because, and you could throw in other revolts as well. You could throw in the Gilets Jaunes protests. You could throw in the fact that social democratic parties across Europe are suffering badly and people are voting for new populist parties like Podemos in Spain, which is a left-wing populist party, although its vote has been going down. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, which is a right-wing populist party, which is doing very well. So all sorts of things are happening. But I think the clearest expression of that populist sentiment is Trump and Brexit. So I do think they are linked. Trump himself talked about Brexit. He and others referred to those states that went against the Democrats and voted for Trump and surprised many people. Trump and others have referred to them as the Brexit states, in the sense that they were kind of inspired by this English revolution that took place, British Revolution.
He's
really.
Mr. Brexit.
He's Mr. Brexit. He calls himself, and because he recognised that Brexit had a certain moral authority with ordinary people, and so he wanted to use that. I think the vote, what the vote for Trump and the vote for Brexit, what they both signify is just a sense of exhaustion with the old establishment. We just don't want more of the same. People on both sides of the Atlantic don't want more of the same. In Britain, we don't want more technocratic snobbery and elitism and nanny statism and all that stuff that comes from being part of the European Union, and mass immigration that we have no control over, all those things. And in the US, they just didn't want the old Hillary Clinton establishment, although you have to point out every time you talk about this that she got more popular votes than he did. But the key thing is that she failed in states that she absolutely needed, particularly among working class, traditional working class Democratic voters who were just completely turned off by what she represented. So on both sides of the Atlantic, the establishment, the old establishment, had become increasingly distant from ordinary people, increasingly disdainful of ordinary people. Hillary embodied that in the US. The European Union embodied it for many British voters, and so people rebelled against those two things and voted for Brexit and voted for Trump. So I think there's loads and loads of similarities. What they both speak to, I think, in a very positive sense, is ordinary voters becoming much more assertive and saying, we're going to shake things up. We're not going to play by your rules. We're going to kind of raise awkward questions about politics as it's been done over the past few decades. That's really positive. Even if the end result is Trump doing this crazy stuff, that's very positive. And then you mentioned impeachment. The response of the old establishment, the liberal elite in America, is to try and get Trump thrown out of office in a legalistic way via impeachment, even though impeachment is supposed to be reserved for presidents who've committed high crimes, like serious crimes, which he clearly hasn't done, even if he has done a few dodgy things. Clearly hasn't committed a high crime. Impeachment's only been used, I think, 2 or 3 times in the entire history of the American Republic. So what they're doing, they're exploiting impeachment to try and crush the votes of 60 plus million people by getting Trump out of office. And I think that could end up benefiting Trump, because he'll be able to say to his voter base, I told you couldn't trust this establishment. I told you the East Coast elites were anti-democratic and hate you. So vote for me again, and that may well work.
Let's talk about the future. 2020, what the Brexit opportunities are. But first of all, 2019, we vote for Boris. Big majority. First big majority for a Conservative since 1987. Worst result for Labour since 1935. Now that many would see as the working classes again, or the ordinary people saying, we've had enough, we're going to get on with Brexit. Donald Trump in America, he's going to be re-elected, maybe, in November this year. And we've got this global phenomenon of the ordinary people, the masses, voting against the establishment in their countries, or rebelling against the establishment in their countries. Do you see that moving forward? Do you see that continuing in the future? I mean, do you think Donald Trump will be elected, for example? Do you think these movements will continue to grow and build momentum?
I hope so. I really do hope they will. I even hope Trump gets re-elected, and I say that someone who's not particularly a fan of Trump, but I hope this momentum carries on, because it's so important. It's so important as a kind of massive historic check on all the terrible directions that politics was going in. It's so essential that it carries on, because politics has had increasingly, in the whole post-war period in fact, but then particularly from the 1970s and 1980s onwards, politics had become increasingly insulated from democratic pressure and from ordinary people. And that's just unsustainable. That's unfair, it's unequal, and it's unsustainable. In a democratic country, we're all supposed to have a proper say, like a meaningful say about how things should be done and about how the country should be governed. So I've always seen the populist revolts of the past few years as a necessary check on the downward spiral of democratic life in Western nations, where democratic life was becoming increasingly sclerotic and slow and distant from ordinary people's concerns. So what we now have is a corrective, and the corrective is vast numbers of voters saying we've got to get things back on track. We've got to get democracy back on track. So I really hope it continues. I think the vote for Boris is key to a lot of this. I think in many ways the vote for Boris, particularly the working class vote for Boris, is, if anything, the most important public expression of populist revolt so far, maybe even more than Brexit itself, because this was the thing to bear in mind. The reason it's so important is because people in Europe have voted against the European Union many times. People in Greece did it, people in Ireland, people in Italy, people in the Netherlands, people in France. Many times over the past 20 years, they've voted against the European Union. But every time they've been defeated by the establishment. So every time the establishment has either gone ahead and done it anyway, or forced them to vote again under huge economic pressure and blackmail, essentially. And it's been defeated every time. This is the first time that a vote against the European Union has not been defeated. And it's the first time the people have reprimanded the establishment and said, oh, hold on, no, you can't just stop our vote. We won't accept that. So I think the vote for Boris, the working class revolt against the Labour Party and the working class revolt against Remainerism and the broader cross-class vote for Boris was really the nation saying, we're sticking to this. Our desire to make politics meaningful again is not going to be thrown off course by awful people in the establishment. So it was such an important statement, and I think that could energise American voters, and I think it could energise European voters and really send the signal to them that it's really worth carrying on with this populist revolt, because we do need politics to become more engaged, more democratic, and more open to people's concerns.
We're optimists. We've talked about that. What are you optimistic about in 2020? Brexit's finally happening.
I'm optimistic about democracy. I'm optimistic about freedom. I think we could see a swing towards greater freedom of speech, the greater right of people to express themselves. I think things are moving slowly in that direction. I'm optimistic about the defeat of an establishment that had treated people pretty shoddily for a long time. And I'm optimistic about Britain. And I'm in this peculiar position because I come from an Irish background. Everything I've ever done is Irish. And in fact, the first time I really properly felt proud to be British was actually in 2016 with the vote for Brexit. Prior to that, I was one of those people who always had a conflicted national identity because my entire family is Irish and I was born in the UK. But I felt that the attachment to Britain incredibly strongly when there was the vote for Brexit. And I'm sure British people felt that as well. Just they felt a reattached to the nation, reattached to the sense of a national project, reattached to a sense of community. And I think the thing I'm most optimistic about across the West, in fact, but particularly in the UK, is just the ideal of solidarity. And I think that's what people are really looking for. They're looking for connection. They're looking for connection with their communities, connection with the people who live around them, and connection with a nation. They want something bigger than themselves. And what we're getting from the elite is just this incredibly individuated politics. This idea that the politics of identity, or the politics of managerialism, which is basically about the establishment looking after people because we're all quite weak and pathetic and can't run our lives for ourselves. Just this very atomizing, individuating politics, which treats us all as individual units to be looked after, or individual units who must be flattered and whose identities must be celebrated. That's the nature of politics over the past few years. And what people have pushed back against is all of that, and they're saying, we're searching for solidarity, we're searching for connection, we're searching for a sense of community and a sense of national belonging. And I'm very optimistic about that. I'm very optimistic about people wanting a sense of national belonging, finally achieving it. And I think people don't understand just how many leaps forward Britain could make if there was a serious sense of national belonging, a serious sense of national togetherness, and a serious sense that democracy is about engaging the entire community in making big decisions about the future. And if we can establish those things over the next 5 or 10 years, I think public life in this country could improve immeasurably.
On that positive note, Brendan O'Neill, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.